Hello, I'm Kendi. Today we're going to learn about a fundamental concept in programming loops. By the end of this video, you'll understand how and when to use loops and how they'll allow you to repeat actions efficiently in your code. So, what are loops? Loops are a sequence of instructions that are executed repeatedly until a certain condition is met. This allows your program to perform the same action or code over and over again until a specific requirement is satisfied. The main purpose of loops is to automate repetitive tasks. Instead of writing the same code multiple times, you can use a loop to automate the process. This not only saves time but can also help avoid redundancy, which makes your code cleaner and easier to maintain. In Python, there are two primary types of loops, for loops and while loops, and I'll explain the difference next. Now that we've covered the basics of loops and their purpose, let's take a closer look at for loops. A for loop allows you to iterate over a sequence of elements. It's designed to work with any Python object that can return its elements one at a time. This includes lists, strings, tuples, and more. For example, suppose we have a list of fruit and we want to print out each fruit in the list. In this list we have apple, pear, kiwi, and banana. The basic syntax of a for loop in Python will look like this: for fruit in fruits, colon, and then press enter. Here, fruit is the variable that takes the value of each item in the list, aka fruits, as the loop iterates over the list. The colon indicates the start of the loop body, and the indented block of code is where you specify what you want to do with each element. In this case, we're just printing the elements. And if we go ahead and run this and look at our terminal, we see we printed out each fruit: apple, pear, kiwi, and banana. You can also use for loops to iterate over a string. Suppose we have a variable text that holds the string I love WISP. We can create another for loop like so, char standing for character because we're looping through each character in the string, to therefore print that character. When we run this code, it will print out each character in the variable text on a new line. Building on an understanding of basics for loops, let's talk about the range function. The range function is used to generate a sequence of numbers, allowing you to modify the starting and stopping values, along with the incrementing value. The range function is useful because it provides a convenient way to iterate over a range of numbers without having to manually create a list of those numbers. The range function can take up to 3 arguments: the starting value, stopping value, and the step or incrementing value. Let's see this concept used in practice. Let's start off with one argument. For example, for I in range 5. I stands for iteration. I is just a variable name, so you can technically name it whatever you want. Y, X, Z. But for better clarification, we'll just name it I. So when you print the variable I, the values 0 through 4 will be outputted to the terminal. This happens because loops start at 0. Even in a list, the first element is at index 0. So when generating a sequence of numbers by iteration, it starts from 0 and goes up to, but does not include the specified stop value. When you use 2 arguments, you can now specify the starting value. For example, for I in range 3 through 8, this will print out 3 through 7. Notice that the starting value is inclusive, but the stopping value is not inclusive. It starts at 3 but stops at 8, so 8 isn't printed out. Remember the rules of inclusion in this case, because this can cause a lot of logical errors in your code. When you use 3 arguments, you can now specify the incrementing value. For example, for I in range 2 through 10 and incrementing by 2. This will print out 2 through 9, but also skip every other number. This can be helpful if you want to, for example, print out all even numbers. Okay, let's now do some practice problems to better your understanding of for loops. The first problem is to write a program that takes a number n and calculates the sum of all numbers from 1 to n. For example, if n is equal to 3, it will print out 6 because 1 plus 2 plus 3 equals 6. Please pause this video and try this on your own, and when you're done or get stuck, let's solve it together. To solve this problem, we can use a for loop that iterates from 1 to n. During each iteration, we'll add the current number to a running total. First, let's initialize our variables. We'll have the variable n that can hold the value of any number, then we'll need a variable to store the total sum, which we can start at 0. We'll now create the for loop to iterate from 1 to n plus 1, because remember, the stopping value is not inclusive, and we need to make sure we're including our number n in the total. Inside the loop, we'll assign total to total plus I, which will add the current value of I to the total. To simplify that line of code, though, we can also write that as total plus equals I. At the end of the loop, or when it reaches 10, total will contain the sum of all numbers from 1 to 10, and then we can just print that out. And when we output the code, we get 55 because 10 plus 9 plus 8 all the way to 1 equals 55. And we could change that end value to 5 to get 15, or we could change it to 3 to get 6. Okay, for the next practice problem, we need to write a program that counts the number of vowels in a given string. This problem involves some knowledge on if statements, so if you haven't watched that video, please do so. Pause the video and give it a try. So looking at the question, we'll need something that checks if the character is a vowel while looping through it. And if it is, we'll increment the counter. First, let's initialize our variables. We'll have a variable named text, which can hold any string we want. We'll have another variable which will hold a list of vowels. So A, E, I, O, and U. And lastly, we'll have a variable that stores the count of vowels, which we can start at 0. Next, we'll use a for loop to iterate over each character in the string text. So for char in text, if char in vowels, count is then incremented by 1. Here, char will take on each character in the string text. Inside the loop, we check if the char is in the list of vowels, and if it is, we increment the counter by 1. If not, we exit the if statement and we check the next character in the string until we've looped through the whole string. Finally, we print count and we get 3 because hello world has 3 vowels in it. If we try another string like my name is Kendi, I believe we'll get 5 vowels. The last practice problem we're going to do is write a program that finds the largest number in a list. This program also requires knowledge on conditional statements, so please make sure you watch the conditional videos presented by Cielo before attempting this problem. Pause the video and give it a try. This problem is straightforward. We need to write a program that takes a list of numbers and finds the largest in that list. For example, given the list 3, 5, 2, 8, 6, the program should return 8 because it's the largest number. First, let's initialize a variable. So let's go ahead and create the list of numbers 3, 5, 8, 2, and 6. For simplicity's sake, we'll start by assuming all numbers are larger than 0. So the largest equals 0 for now. We'll then go ahead and use a for loop to iterate through the rest of the numbers and compare each one to our current largest number. Let's go ahead and write the for loop. For number in numbers, number representing each element in the numbers list. If number is greater than largest, we go ahead and update largest with that number. But if it's not greater than largest, we exit the if statement and loop through to the next element in the numbers list. And if we go ahead and print out the largest, we should be getting 8 because 8 is the largest in the list. There you go. And if you change the numbers around, take away 8, 6 should be the largest now. And if you add in 12, replace 6 with 1, 12 should be the largest in the list. One more thing I wanted to talk about with for loops are pass statements. Pass statements are unique to for loops, and these are incredibly useful when it comes to debugging code, and you don't want certain functions like a for loop to be running while you isolate a problem in your code. For example, when I write a standard for loop like this for x in this list that contains 0, 1, and 2, and by the way, this is another way you can write a for loop. Instead of making another variable to declare a list, you can just implement it into the for loop statement itself. But if I continue and print out x, as expected, I'll get 0, 1, and 2 in the terminal. If I didn't want to print and the loop was just empty, which there's many reasons why you would declare an empty for loop, but the main reason is if you just want to define the structure but haven't implemented the logic yet. When you press run, you get an error. If I want to bypass this error, where the executed code would typically be, you write pass, and when you run the code, there will be no error. In conclusion, understanding for loops is crucial for any Python coder. These loops are like the bread and butter of Python programming, helping us to cycle through lists, strings, and other collections of data. We learned about the range function, which is typically used when we know the number of times we want to specify over the code. And we also learned about pass statements, which is used when we have an empty loop and need a placeholder to keep our code intact and prevent error. Taking one more look at the syntax for item in sequence, here item is the variable you're creating and assigning to each element in the sequence. It can be named to whatever your heart desires, but it's highly recommended to use a name that correlates to your code. As for sequence, it's always the thing or entity you're looping through. The other commonly used loops are while loops. A while loop allows you to execute a block of code as long as a given condition is true. Once that condition is no longer met, the loop is exited. Let's go ahead and look at some examples. Say we wanted to count from 1 to 5. Let's make a variable I that holds the value 1. To create our while loop, we type while and then the condition, which for this example would be while I is less than 6. If we're counting up to 5, we can also write this conditional statement as I is less than or equal to 5. Let's keep it at I is less than 6. Everything after this colon is executed while I is less than 6. And let's go ahead and make sure we print those values. We have to make sure to update the value in the condition or you'll create an infinite loop, which means your code has no way of exiting and keeps running because the condition isn't changing. If we don't update, I will remain 1 and will always be less than 6. And when we click run, we get 1 through 5. While loops are especially helpful when involving user input. Say for example we want to calculate the sum of numbers until the user enters 0. This is how we'll go about that. Let's first assign the variable number to the user's input, and let's add a prompt in there that says enter a number. Let's make another variable for the total, which will start at 0. This essentially has the same implementation in the first practice problem we did when discussing for loops. Now let's create the while loop. While the number, aka the user input, is not 0, by the way, the exclamation mark and equal signs together is the notation for not equals. Since we are comparing number to an integer 0, we want to make sure that the input we're receiving from the user is also an integer. So I'm just going to go ahead and convert that to an integer. Then we're going to update the total with the given number each time we go through the loop. But to keep getting input from the user, we must add this line to the loop. Now all we do is print out the sum is and then the total. Let's go ahead and run the program and see what happens. We first get asked as the user to enter a number. 2, 3, 1, 6, 8, and 0, which makes the condition false, so we exit the loop and print the sum is 20. Let's try again. 2, 1, 0. We exit the loop and the sum is 3. Now that we have a good understanding of both for and while loops, let's discuss what continue, break, and else statements are. The continue statement is used within loops to skip the rest of code inside the current iteration and move to the next iteration of the loop. Let's see how this works. Let's have a list of colors. Pink, green, orange, yellow, and red. Say for example we want to skip the color orange. We can do so by looping through the list and checking if it's the color we want to skip. After looping through, let's create an if statement that says if item equals orange. The double equal sign is a comparison operator that means equals to. So if that statement is true, let's go ahead and write the continue statement. And then let's print each item. Let's hit run and see what happens. As you can notice, orange was skipped. This is because when the current iteration or item is orange, the continue statement is executed, which causes the loop to skip the remaining code and move on to the next iteration. So it doesn't print out that item, or in this case, doesn't print out the word orange. Now let's look at break statements. The break statement is used to immediately terminate a loop regardless of the loop's condition. Let's try and break out of a while loop. Let's create a variable n which is equal to 1. Then let's create a while loop while n is less than or equal to 10. And then let's print out n. Within this loop, let's implement an if statement with the condition n equals 5. Then let's add the break statement within the if statement. Let's update n by 1 and see what happens when we run the code. As you can see, we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. When the break statement is executed, we exit the loop and continue with the next statement after the loop. So when the statement is true, or in this case when n equals 5, we stop printing the values. We can change the if statement to n equals 2 to stop printing values at 2. Finally, let's look at else statements really quickly. Else statements execute once the loop has been completed. If we want to, for example, print text or perform any other task after this loop is finished, we can implement the else statement on the next line and write a command. As you can see, unlike the first run, we now have the outputted statement, "These pets are the best," after printing out each element in the list. Let's do a practice problem. Write a program that simulates a simple user authentication. Before diving into this problem, let me give you some more background information and steps to follow to help you solve this problem. Step 1 is to define the correct password. This can be anything you want for now. Step 2 is to set the number of attempts. This can also be any number you want. Step 3 is to start a while loop that keeps looping while the number of current attempts the user has taken is greater than 0. Step 4 is to ask the user for their password. Step 5 is to check if the user input matches the correct password. Step 6 is to check if the password is correct. If it is, print access granted and exit the loop. But if it isn't, for step 7, you need to decrement the attempt number by 1, and for step 8, print a message indicating the password is incorrect and how many attempts the user has left. Step 9 is if the user has reached 0 attempts, then print access denied. Use the knowledge you have on while, if, else, and break statements to complete this problem. Pause the video and give it a try. Okay, let's solve the problem. First, we need to define what correct password is. We store this in a variable called, for example, correct password. This is the password the user must enter to gain access. Let's call it password 123. Next, we have to set the number of attempts a user has to enter the correct password. We'll start with 3 attempts. We then need to start a while loop. You may be asking why we aren't using a for loop in this case. While it's possible to use either one, a while loop is better suited for this situation because it's more straightforward when we don't know the exact iteration at which the loop will break. The while loop condition directly checks the number of remaining attempts and breaks out immediately upon the correct password entry. In contrast, a for loop iterates a fixed number of times using the range function, which requires additional logic to handle breaking out the loop when the correct password is entered. This makes the while loop a more natural and efficient choice for this specific scenario. Okay, so we want this loop to continue running as long as the number of attempts is greater than 0. This loop allows us to repeatedly ask the user for their password until they run out of attempts. Inside the loop, we're going to create a variable user input and prompt the user for a password and store it into that variable. Please enter your password. We're then going to use an if statement to compare if the user input is equal to the correct password. If user input equals correct password, and then we're going to print access granted. And we also need to add a break statement to exit the loop and make sure we don't ask the user to enter their password again. Else, or if the password is incorrect, we need to calculate the remaining attempts by decrementing attempts by 1. Then we can go ahead and print a message that says incorrect password, and then tells the user how many attempts they have left. Now we have to handle the case where the user reached 0 remaining attempts. So if attempts equals 0, we print out a statement that says access denied because they used all their attempts, meaning all the passwords they tried were incorrect. Let's go ahead and run the program and see what happens. Please enter your password. Let's try Kendi123. That's obviously not the right password. The correct password is password123. The terminal lets you know I have 2 attempts left. Let's go ahead and try another incorrect password. Lets me know I have 1 attempt left. Another incorrect password. I have 0 attempts, therefore I get the print statement access denied. Let's try again. Let's put in an incorrect password. I have 2 attempts left. This time, let's put the correct password in. Password 123. We get the printed statement access granted because if user input equals the correct password, we print that statement out, break out of the loop, and that's it. Now, let's do a quick overview of all the statements we just learned. The continue statement is used to skip the rest of the current loop iteration and move to the next iteration, allowing specific conditions to bypass parts of the loop without exiting it. The break statement is the complete opposite. It's used to immediately exit the loop regardless of the loop's current condition or remaining iterations. And lastly, else statements and loops execute after the loop completes all iterations without encountering a break statement. This provides a way to run code only if the loop completes normally without interruption.